Hi, everyone. I guess we're ready to get started. I'm Meryl Brodsky. I'm from UT Austin, and I'm hosting this session C3 on data documentation and reproducibility. I'll introduce each speaker between sessions, and then each speaker will give their presentation, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions. So the first presenter is Valentin Brunel. Valentin works at the Center for Sociopolitical Data in the Documentation and Dissemination team. His work consists mainly in elaborating documentation solutions for newly deposited surveys, as well as ensuring the interface between CDSP and depositors.
Thank you, Meryl. Hey, everyone. So this presentation is about documenting a social network survey about the lessons we learned, the ongoing challenges, and I hope to maybe share a few advice that we had come to mind when doing this. So very briefly, to have the introduction of this talk, the idea was we documented a 25-year multi-method survey, which I'm going to present more in depth later. So it's a specific kind of survey, and it was also a very large one with more than 100 and actually 1,000 files in the initial deposit, because it consisted of quantitative data, so variables and data sets, but also of interviews made by the researchers. So there were both text and quantitative data. And yeah, the idea is mainly to share what we did and maybe think about how to generalize it and see a few of the limitations of existing documentation idioms in documenting social network surveys, which are a specific kind of surveys. The plan of the presentation is fairly thorough. So first, briefly, the documentation process of the CDSP and the survey in itself, which is the Caen panel, that's its name, le panel de Caen. Our solution then for documenting a longitudinal network survey, because beside being a network survey, it's also a longitudinal network one. So we'll go more in depth with this. And then the main issues and use of documentation tools, because they are mostly adaptable to let's say more classic survey methods. So to start with what it means documenting the Caen panel at the CDSP with a brief presentation of the CDSP in itself. So the Center for Sociopolitical Data is located in Sciences Po in Paris. It has been documenting and disseminating surveys since 2005. Surveys are mostly in sociology and political science. We recently have a new platform for data dissemination, the Data Sciences Po, of course, and it is based on the Dataverse solution. So you've all seen presentations made related to Dataverse, and I've maybe followed the workshop on this, which was very interesting. And so we've been documenting, let's say, classical surveys since 2005 and social network surveys since 2019. The first one that we did is the picture you see here, Le Phénomène Collégial, which is a survey on the lawyers' networks in New York. Now to briefly introduce the panel de Caen, so the Caen panel. It is a longitudinal survey, which is interested mostly in life course and personal networks. So mainly specialized in the way individuals interact with other people throughout their life and how their networks are constructed and how they evolve. It's a survey that is similar to another one that was made in France, which is the Toulouse cohorts, but it's Panel de Caen is more, it's got more data in it. So yeah, to describe the survey, longitudinal qualitative survey, which began in 1995 with a panel of 80 young people living in the Caen, which is in Normandy region, France. The same people were interviewed then for 20 years for 6 waves. So every 3 years there was a wave. And so the young people that were 18 at the time of the first survey, well, you know, got to grow older and older and see the people that were around them evolve. And so the idea was to show how their relations, some people disappeared, others appeared, and how this evolved depending on the socio-demographic context and well, where they came from and what they did. So the interviews and questionnaires every wave had the trajectories of the people for every month written on a calendar data set, which I'm going to talk more about later. Also information on their professional, family, loving, residential, and associative fields. So what kind of things they did. And the idea was to identify also the important events that occurred during the 3-year period that separated every wave. And finally, to construct the personal network of every individual, which is part of the panel, in order to observe how it evolves according to, well, transition into adulthood, and then other less predictable events that could occur, for example, translocating, going abroad, or separating, all those kind of things. If you're interested in this interesting survey, you have a link there with all the presentation of the survey in English. It's also in French, but I figure in English would be nice for this audience. So to speak more about the survey respondents in themselves, so they were at the time of the first survey in the final year of general or vocational baccalaureate or training course, half boy, half girls, and between 17 and 23 years old. General vocational or training courses, it's a different spheres of education. So general would be, let's say, higher education, well, higher level education. Vocational is already some sort of technical education, and training courses would be people that have left school already. So the idea was to capture different strata of people. 3 years later, so 73 were interviewed, 66 then, the fourth wave, 60 only. So you see the attrition is not too bad. There is some, of course, but it's not too bad. And then the fifth survey wave in 2007 and 2015, so years later, sixth survey was conducted with some of the respondents that were Facebook users, and it was mostly on their social media activity. This is something just to show the interest of this kind of survey. It's based on the, well, this is taken from the book that the writers, researchers did. The main researcher is Claire Bideau, so the first name here. So what you can see on the left is the network of one of the panel survey respondents. As you can see, so there are little names, so Morissette, Lucette, Jean-Pierre, Yann, and all those people are connected depending on whether they know each other or not. So you see, what you see on the first graph would be a very highly centered and connected network. And so that's usually what you would have when you present a social network survey. You have only this first graph. And so it's interesting because you see the shape of the network, how it is interconnected, etc. I think the main interest of this survey is that we can see how this network on the left went to that network on the right. And this is due to the dispersion in the network of the central individual, which is Yann, which was the, we call alter amour, so the romantic partner of the person that was interviewed. And when you see the romantic partner disappears, the network takes a really different shape and it starts being a lot less interconnected. So that's one of the type of findings that you can have with this kind of service. So more specificities about this survey. So it was a collective endeavor, not only on our part, but also on the part of the researchers, because multiple researchers have taken part in it, which means that the existing documentation, if we can call it a documentation, was very heterogeneous and had different kinds of codes for sometimes the same things. And so this was a difficulty because sometimes even the main researcher, which was our contact, could not remember some of the things that were done, so 20 years earlier, and it's someone else had done it. It's also an ongoing research, which is another very important difficulty when you document a survey that is, well, not over because people are still using the data to produce scientific results. There is a challenge in defining what the final data sets might be. So what can be considered good for other people to use and reuse, and what is really and the I like this idea of an ending raw data, ended raw data, final raw data. And finally, the idea was to combine the difficulties and riches of both network and longitudinal surveys. So, well, briefly, our solutions. There is one word that is not in the presentation, but I think encompasses the main idea of this presentation here. We tried to document this sort of very thorough and heterogeneous survey by creating a modular documentation, which means there are little blocks of data and documentation, which can be combined as everybody wants, as anybody would like them to be combined. And we thought it was a more practical way of presenting the data. And I think that's the main takeaway of this presentation. I could stop now, but I will go more into details. Sorry. So an impressive number of data sets was created during fieldworks. So there were already the transcriptions of interviews, then a high number of data sets. And even for the data sets which were called synthesized by the researchers, they compiled all the previous raw data sets, multiple versions of them were created, which can be understandable since the survey lasted for more than 20 years. And since it was an ongoing research and the researcher had not yet taken the time to clean up maybe the data, there was a sort of sedimentation of research questions and variables, which I'm going to show you right now. So this is just a mapping of all the different variables. And so what you could see on number 1 to 10 are all the identification variables. So some of them are, of course, very useful. You have wave, the wave of the in which the person was interviewed, the number of the person, but you see a lot of interlapping things. For example, we have 3 or 4 different variables which are the same for ego, which contain the exact same information. This is okay, understandable maybe for identification, and it's quite easy to solve. You just delete the variables that are in double. But when we come to activity, diploma, or occupation, it becomes a lot more difficult to select the right variable, because without the researcher, you would not know which one of those 5, 6 different variables is actually the one to be kept, and which ones are old versions or have to be corrected. And for example, you could trace back to interviews, and specific coding for occupation was made depending on what the interviewees said during the interviews. So you could go back to this, but then the researcher made some corrections on the occupation depending on other observations that they made on the people themselves. So without the researcher, it's really hard to know what variable is actually the correct one on occupation. Same goes for diploma or activity. So that was also a main source of problem. The sedimentation is also in another way the fact that in the multiple data sets, information was very redundant. So you had the same sort of information across every data set, same, but sometimes not even named in the same way. So it was a big mess, basically. So our choice was to document and disseminate the main synthesized data sets. The first 2 important ones are the ego and relations data set. I will go first through the ego data set, which is the most straightforward. So you have in this data set, which is the one I just showed, you have all the characteristics of all members of the panel at each wave, containing occupation, education, activity, gender, pretty much any socio-demographic variable of importance. Also information pertaining to the size and shape of the network at each different wave, and the main life events, but very basic. Then specific of social network survey is a relations data set. So in social network survey, one is not interested only in a person's even social network or socio-demographic or opinions or whatever. Also interested in every relation happening between people that are inside the circle. So in this relations data set, every line is not a person nor a person and a wave. Every line is a relation with the characteristic of both the ego, the alter, or the other alter, and the characteristic of the relation. I'm going to show this very briefly now. So you would have here, for example, the variable sim sex, sim age, sim independence, which mean, for example, that ego and alter have the similarity in sex, so it's 0, 1. Same for age. Are they in the same age class? Are they living independently both? Are they both having children? So we can see that what is characterized here is not the ego, it's not the alter, it's the relation between them both. So it's sort of original, but this is what allows for different results, let's say, that's with more original surveys. So the idea was also to document this synthesized data set with taking out all the information pertaining only to ego in this data set. And finally, one that is more related to the longitudinal aspects is the calendar dataset. So it combines for all members of the panel for every month of the 20-year survey, recollection of the main life events that occurred concerning jobs, educations, their relations, of course, and eventual translocations, relocations. And this data set, as you can see, is presented in this way. So you have a sequential number, the wave, the ego, the year, month, and then, for example, rési d'état 3 would be the residential state of the person at this time. And so you see that we also have some variables relating to what eventually changed during this month. So say on May 1995, ego 1 separated. And so this would be in the calendar dataset. So this is how the three main data sets can be interconnected. So of course, at the base is the ego data set with, so V would be for wave, VAG, X is the number of the ego. So you have for this first data set, the wave, ego, and then socio-demographic or network information. It can be related to the relations data set, which is on top, where you have wave 1, ego, which would be X1, and then alter 1, alter 2, alter 3, and then all the information related to the relation. And this can also be tied to the events or calendar data sets, which is the third one, which is below. And so V1, ego 1, and then month 1, and then all the information on what occurred during this month. So the idea of having those different data sets put together was not to be too redundant on information and to allow for people to select what information they would rather have. So yeah, I mean, the advantages is the lots more economical layout of the information, no redundancy. Every data set is also interesting in itself. Say, for example, because it's, again, a very rich and thorough survey, one could be, especially, for example, let's imagine a graduate student would be only interested in the information on ego and its network at every wave. Therefore, they could only download this one and not be preoccupied with the relations. So every dataset is also interesting in itself. Key identifiers allow for merging of information between datasets, and there is a clear distinction, both logical and practical, between what panel members were, how they related to others, and when their main life events occurred. Finally, on the use and issues of the main documenting tools that we usually use. CDSP usually documents studies using DDI codebook, which most of you may know. It's well adapted for traditional surveys, so questionnaire, random sampling, etc. Here are a few lists of the information that you would find on this documentation standards. I put in red those that were not quite well adapted to our surveys. So some fields do not adapt well to the companel. For example, at the study level, the methodological information, well, is very specific in codebook and well adapted to traditional surveys. We had to add additional information in the free fields or in notes, which was not great. Maybe, I don't know, one could think of adding maybe less specific fields in codebook to adapt to those different kind of surveys. Then at the variable level, of course, we have the same problems with the filter. Filter in the questionnaire is when a question is jumped. This would not really adapt to our kind of surveys, which was not directly based on the questionnaire, but on a more original instrument. Yeah, we did not use it, and we had to transform some DDI fields into better suited information, be it notes or a question, for example. But I think one of the key rules that we tried to follow in the documentation process was not to modify what the field actually means. For example, we're not going to take filter and say, okay, we'll change filter and take it into network shape, for example, which would have no sense and not allow for comparability between different surveys in our catalog. Also, so yeah, another solution that we have is compared to what we usually do, we have a filing plan this time. So it is kind of complex because there are data sets inside separate repertories, but it is all explained in a thorough README file, which I hope the people will read. And well, it's called README, so they should. The additional information regarding specific network indicators and the way they were constructed will be provided in separate documentation files. This additional information being written especially by the researcher because, well, they know more about this. And I think one of the lessons is that for specific complex studies, the documentation itself will have to be longer and denser. it means of more implications from the researchers, because without them, well, we alone cannot do it. But I think altogether it's a more gratifying process. So in conclusion, of course, the purpose of documenting surveys is reuse and how we can make sure data is combined in new and exciting ways. And I think that's what we try to favor by constituting little blocks of data concerning network relations, calendars, etc. And so, yeah, there is a very high potential for reuse in the survey. And we hope that this solution will let us avoid the difficulties pertaining to the mass of data, because people can select the kind of data they want. Also, I think, so yeah, mainly for pretty much every CDSP network surveys documentation, we have at least an ego and a relations data set, which is, well, the basis for network surveys. Yeah, without going into details between the trade-off between understandability and completeness, I think one of the other interesting things with our solution is that it provides for complementary data which can be added over the years. Say, for example, the researcher wants to add a little block of geographical data set to see the influence of, if one person goes to this country, goes this far from the other person, etc., how it changes the relation that they're going to have, and how it changes also the whole size of the network and when it actually changes. Say, for example, I move to Lyon. How is my network going to change, and how soon will I, for example, make new friends, and when will I break up? Those kind of things. And also Colin relations data sets, which means informations on networks constituted in the other way around. Now it's a line, and we could also make it into columns, which allows for easier processing of some analysis. Yep, that was all. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm willing to take any questions.
So are there any questions? Any questions online?
Got it. Meryl. Oh, got it. There. Where was the hand?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Valentin is my colleague. So
This is called cheating.
no, it's not cheating. So I've heard you. I've seen you working with the researcher and the researchers of the project. And I was wondering, as a data manager, it's a difficult question. What do you think the role of the data manager is, not only in concerning the data management, but also on the data collection? What would you change if you could in an ideal situation? Of course, you can change the past, but as you said, it's the data collection continues. So yeah, what do you think should be done maybe differently by the researcher and with us?
Okay, well, thanks. Quite frankly, I wouldn't really change anything, but to answer your question about the role of data manager in this kind of thing, the main idea is to say to the researcher, yes, this variable is surely very, very interesting, but can you explain it in a simple way so that people can reuse it and know what they are talking about when they reuse it? If you are, great, then we add both the variable and its explanation. But if it's either too complicated, or you can't find what it was, or you're not sure that it's going to be of any use to anyone, then maybe we'll leave this variable away and not put it in the variable, which is difficult for a researcher to hear this kind of thing, that this variable that they spent months in constructing is not going to be in the final data set because nobody is ever going to reuse it, and it's just going to confuse potential users. That's, I think one of the main roles is to keep things simple, understandable. And it's also, I think, something that is in a later way appreciated by the researchers, because when they look at the final data sets, usually they enjoy the job we did and they say, okay, this is much clearer and understandable, and maybe we didn't need all those variables that were all the same eventually.
Thank you.
We have a question in the Zoom chat up there. Which tool do you use for the creation of DDI codebook for these data sets?
Yeah, we use mainly Nesta, which you may know. This is for documenting at the variable level. There is lots of data editing before putting the data sets on Nesta, the different data sets on Nesta. But once the data sets are well edited using R, then we can go on there and add all the variable level information. As for the study level, we document it directly on the Dataverse. We have specific list of DDI codebook items that we favor in the CDSP, and so this allows us to have a clear mapping of all important information. So this is also one of the maybe things we could change in the near future. It's right now we document using at least 3 different instruments, and it would be a lot easier if we could only do it in one, but I guess that's for later purposes.
It's clear that actually the social network structure doesn't fit exactly to this DDI variable documentation format. So I'm kind of curious if you search if there is any kind of standard way how to actually model or describe this kind of data, because there are certain softwares that use the structure, and maybe this is the way to approach this.
Yeah, actually, lots of survey network surveys usually are given around by researchers because they're made of matrices, etc. And for example, for us, the fact of choosing the relations data set is already a choice by not having the matrices, but only the relations, which can sort of fit into DDI model. I looked a little at what other centers were doing. I saw ICPSR had a few network surveys, and usually what they did was have both the matrices and the relations by line data sets in the final package. That's what we did also for the previous surveys, but I think for this one, the survey in itself being complicated and having both longitudinal and network, it was important not to have information being redundant and have the same, basically the same information, but only presented in different ways. So that's why we had this sort of economical solution. But I don't know, I would be very curious to see some more work done by others on those kind of surveys. Yeah. I hope this answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we're moving on to the next presentation. This is the Journal Editor's Discussion Interface, Building and Fostering Community. It's a virtual presentation by Dr. Priya Silverstein. Priya is the community manager for the Journal Editor's Discussion Interface, JEDI. JEDI provides the community of social science journal editors a forum in which to ask and answer questions, share information and expertise, and build a fund of collective knowledge. Priya has a background in psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and metascience.
Thanks lots. Is everything all good? I think I can see my own slides being shared, so that's good. I know that's working. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, and thanks so much for having me. Thanks for the introduction. I'm Priya. Like you said, I'm a researcher with a background in developmental science and metascience mostly. And I'm the community manager for JEDI, for the Journal Editors Discussion Interface. And what that involves, which will make a bit more sense when I've introduced what JEDI is talking one-to-one with journal editors in the social sciences facilitating conversations on our listserv and collating resources for editors. So the reason journal editors are kind of such an important group is because they act as gatekeepers for their individual fields. So in a kind of, we've all heard the phrase publish or perish, and in if we take that to be true, then I guess the people who are deciding what gets published and what what policies and practices to have at their journal that you have to kind of comply with in order to publish your research, they're a really important group because they're kind of dictating what research gets done in their subfields. And as well as kind of being scary gatekeepers, journal editors can also be agents of positive change. So because I'm from psychology, that's kind of where my network mostly lies. So I've got some great examples from psychology of journal editors being agents of positive change. So, you know, developing and initiating new types of article at their journal. So verification reports where people reproduce results from a previous paper and show whether or not they can be verified. People, you know, journals subscribing to certain open science initiatives like the top standards, and then also, you know, thinking about how to support diverse voices at their journal, etc. So they're in this great position, both with lots of power and also, which is scary, but also good because it means that they can kind of be at the forefront of these changes. So JEDI was initially conceptualized by the DataPass initiative. So the Data Preservation Alliance for the Social Sciences, DataPass, is a partnership of people from different organizations and data repositories in that catalog data in the social sciences. And so the idea was basically initially so first before JEDI was a kind of online community. Instead what happened was these kind of yearly workshops between 2016 and 2020 between representatives from DataPass, so representatives from different social science data repositories and journal editors. And it was to facilitate this kind of conversation between the two groups, both so that journal editors could kind of feed back to data repositories about what they needed and what would be most useful for them in order to implement, for example, data sharing policies at their journals or set up journal specific repositories, etc. But equally for data repositories to, equally for journal editors to hear more about what data repositories were doing and what they could offer and how they could kind of use those resources a bit better. So when JEDI became an online community, because even though these conversations were super helpful, they were only happening maximum once a year and with these small groups. And so the idea was to have a much bigger online community where social science journal editors and scholarly knowledge builders could come together in the same kind of exchange way, but just online and not at a specific time. So scholarly knowledge builders here means anyone who, so including people from data management from different data repositories, but also any other kind of field that might have some sort of expertise that would be really helpful to combine and exchange with journal editors. So this can be, for example, meta scientists who are studying the peer review process. It could be open science experts that aren't necessarily knowledgeable about just data, but other types of open science, or anything else that would be useful for this bidirectional exchange. So to invite all these people together into an online community. The idea then was to curate resources for social science journal editors. So when people would be having conversations in this online community, to be pooling together the resources that came out of that. Also to catalyze conversation, because we were aware that starting a new online community, you can't just expect people to automatically like be really into it and start communicating all the time. So the idea was to invite some members to become JEDI catalysts, so to agree to post on the listserv on specific dates. That would then hopefully lead to more conversation. We aim to also summarize in a newsletter the conversations that were happening, highlighting resources and inviting further input from other people. And in general, all of this together, the overarching goal was to guide, where appropriate, guide editors towards the best practices and future of publishing and implementing open science related policies and practices at their journal, but in a very light touch way. So they're open to have conversations about anything to do with editing, but where we could steer conversation either towards or just provide resources when people ask questions, we would do that. So far JEDI has in just over a year 380 members, which we're very happy about. And as you can see from this, I don't know if this is probably too small, but I'll kind of explain it anyway. So the two biggest groups are of our members are psychology and political science editors, which makes sense considering I'm from a psychology background. I'm the JEDI community manager, and Colin Elman, who is the PI of the grant, is a political scientist. So no wonder our network kind of worked itself out this way. But I think this is a slightly out of date graph. So I think by now we've managed to even it out very slightly, and always striving to do that more. So as you can see, when I was talking about social science, we're really right across the social sciences. So anthropology, criminology, economics, education, geography, political science, psychology, and sociology. And then when I was talking earlier about scholarly knowledge builders, the types of some other types of members that we have are people from data management, we even have data librarians, meta scientists, people in the publishing world, anything that kind of would be useful to facilitate these conversations. So as I kind of briefly mentioned, JEDI is an online community, and that, so specifically what that is, that the main kind of two things that we have is a mailing list and a resource collection. So the mailing list it functions as a Google group. So we have 380 members, and so far over 150 threads have been posted. In our resource collection, which so the group is private only to members, but the resource collection is open to anyone who wants to check out the resources. We have over 45 contributors contributing over 200 resources in just a year. So we're really happy with that. So on the mailing list, just some example topics that have had a lot of engagement. We had a very kind of active conversation about positionality statements. So these are very common in qualitative research and certain fields, and the question was whether to kind of bring them into quantitative research as well, whether they'd still be relevant. We've had conversations about requirements for data citation, how journals can support preprints, so whether journals should be kind of actively implementing things in their workflows that kind of integrate preprints into that workflow, for example, posting preprints as soon as a paper is submitted to their journal, and etc. Taking into account reviews of preprints, things like that. We've had a lot of conversations about the pros and cons of masked versus open reviewing. This is a really good one kind of to chat about, because it's one where there's not really, I mean, there's never really a simple answer, but especially in this case, the more open is not necessarily the more better. So for that reason, that's been a really active conversation as well. Another one was collecting demographic data on authors, reviewers, and editors, and how collecting that data can aid in kind of diversifying all of those different kind of categories at a certain journal. And so these topics and all other topics that are covered often result in people sharing relevant resources. And so we, like I said, we have our resource collection. Our biggest section is on open science. So for example, data and code, policies, pre-registration and registration. Open peer review, but you can see that we have lots of other topics as well. Incentivizing reviews, anything that kind of if someone shares a resource, we try and incorporate it into the collection. And so in May 2022, we had a JEDI workshop and covered a lot of the same topics that that have already been brought up on the listserv and in the resource collection. So we had 2 plenaries on how journal editors can shape incentives for researchers and the pros and cons of open peer review. We had over 90 sign-ups, which is great. We also had 6 breakout sessions, and have previously spoken about these topics on like computational reproducibility, diversity in journal editing, incentivizing reviews, choosing data repositories, working with preprints and pre-registration and registered reports. So as you can see, a lot of overlap. But there have been obviously some challenges to fostering this scientific community. And so 2 main ones kind of stand out. So one is the time-limited nature of editorial roles. So editors usually are only editors for a fixed term at a certain journal. And even though there are some people who choose to then become editors at several journals, often that's not the case. And you'll just have an editor kind of doing it for a few years and then not doing it again. And we would love to have the input from like all stages of editors, so people who used to be and aren't anymore, people who currently are editors, and people who maybe want to be or are kind of going to be starting the role soon. But one of the problems is that editors who are finished with their role often understandably don't want to be involved in the community. I've even, in the most extreme case, actively saying to me like, thank God I'm not an editor anymore, I'm done with that kind of thing. So the kind of time limited nature of the roles makes it difficult to keep people in the community, and also it makes it just a logistical nightmare for kind of knowing the most recent kind of team at any journal and doing the research to make sure you're kind of contacting the right people at each journal. And then the other, I think, probably even bigger challenge is about identity. So I think, identity is different for everyone, and but I think that a lot of academics in each field are more likely to identify as a scientist or a researcher or their specific discipline, so a psychologist, a sociologist, than they are to specifically identify as being an editor. And that makes it quite difficult because, part of creating a sense of community can involve like tapping into that identity aspect. So it's been difficult for us to kind of decide whether to try and enhance that sense of editorial identity, if that's even a thing, in the members, or whether to just kind of accept that that's not part of their identity and just try and make it as useful a community as possible, that they can still use it to do their job, even if it's not like a community in an identity way. And a couple of other challenges we've had are in membership and engagement. So at the beginning, when we had our JEDI catalysts who were posting when we kind of asked them to nicely, we did get lots of conversation happening when the catalyst posted. So all that, we didn't have to kind of ask people to reply to the post, people just naturally would. But we did get very few organic threads being started. Now that's getting a little bit better, and we have a combination of both catalyst posts and organic posts. But it was a little bit difficult to get it off the ground in that way, where all the conversation that's happening was organic. And another big issue is in diversity. So luckily we've managed to get a really good gender balance in membership, even though in a lot of fields it's still the case that there's a lot that males dominate editorial positions in those fields. But nevertheless, we have in our membership quite good gender diversity. But the type of diversity that we really need to work on is geographic and disciplinary, as I talked about before, but the disciplinary is getting a lot better. So geographic is our main priority at the moment, because a lot of the initial outreach we did was to like American Society of, and then the discipline and the editors at those journals. So we are working hard now to branch out into global journals. Another another kind of future direction / challenge has been in reaching consensus. So what we've noticed is that even though our resource collection is growing really rapidly, which is really great, that means that number one, the static web page is not really fit for purpose because it doesn't have like searchability really, or like advanced ways to get like wade through the information, and the bigger it gets, the more challenging that gets. Another issue is that because the sections are created organically based on conversation, this isn't systematic. So that means unequal coverage for different topics. So you might just have a particularly lively conversation on a topic that isn't necessarily more important than any of the other topics in the resource collection, and yet it has a really big section just because people are sharing a lot of resources there. And so to tackle each of these problems, one thing we're doing is we're creating an easing into open science guide for editors. So this is based on the format of a guide that I previously co-authored called Easing into Open Science for Graduate Students, which went through the what's, whys, hows, and worries of different open science practices and how graduate students could get involved in them. So this will mirror that structure, but be about how editors can ease into open science policies and practices at their journals instead. So that will hopefully be a bit of a kind of a way to wade through the resources for editors that kind of narrativizes it, if that's even a word, instead of kind of having to wade through these resources by themselves. And the other thing We recently submitted a grant for JEDI 2.0, which as part of it would include kind of developing a way to host the resource collection that is a bit more fit for purpose and able to grow. And as well as that, actively creating resources where there are gaps in certain kind of sub areas of open science and journal editing. So what's next for JEDI? We have recently conducted a community survey for our members, and so we'll be kind of looking through the data there to see what they want from the community, what the changes we can make there to make it better for them. As I've already mentioned, diversification both geographically and disciplinary. And eventually the aim would be to make JEDI something that's self-sustaining, that doesn't need active community management, so that, you know, we wouldn't be relying on only if we could get further funding would the community continue. I think we're kind of in a bit of a place at the moment where we're not really sure what things would look like if funding did run out, and we don't want it to be like that. We want the community to kind of be self-sustaining and keep itself alive even without active management. So thanks to Colin, Elman, the PI of the JEDI grant, the DataPass team, the JEDI steering committee, JEDI members, our funding, and you for listening. Thanks. Feel free to ask questions, I guess, in the chat or elsewhere.
Sorry, are there any questions here in the audience? Okay, sorry.
Thank you, Priya. This was a great presentation. I'm Janez Šteber from Slovenia, and I recently joined the JEDI community. And actually, I would like to mention maybe only one thing, and maybe we shall discuss afterwards on more of the details, because Insight says that we also have a kind of project to support journals and to communicate with journal editors, and actually we also focus on how the data services to adapt to the needs of the journals. But here, what you presented, I think that there is a lot of potential to collaborate, for example, in geographical coverage, for sure, because we are more focusing maybe for now on the national journals, which are typically small and with small editorial teams, but also to the resources for the journals that we also aim to kind of collect and communicate. So this is just maybe a few points that are important here.
Yeah, thanks. That's so exciting. I always collaboration like that would be really great. It's yeah, it seems like we definitely have common goals and would love to see where we can take that. So definitely get in touch after this.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering if, since it is mostly a discussion list, if it happens sometimes that there are contradicting opinions, and how you solve this into the discussion list, like when a question is asked. And I also had two relative side questions. Did you ever think of calling the JEDI members the JEDI Knights? And did you ever think of having some social events which you could call, for example, the JEDI Knights?
So to your two later points, both really great suggestions. I think one of the big downsides to me being a community manager is that I've never actually seen Star Wars, which is probably should have meant that I didn't even get interviewed. So but yeah, those are both very good ideas. I'll take notes. And then with regards to controversies and kind of contradictions on the listserv, yeah, I think because our goal so far, until like the grant that we submitted now, which we'll see if we get, and has not been to kind of come to a consensus necessarily, then we've just been monitoring those types of discussions, making sure that it's all kind of above bar and no one is like kind of being nasty or bullying each other, etc. Apart from that, we're completely happy to have disagreements, and those are often the kind of threads that are the most active, or as you'd imagine, are the ones where people strongly disagree with each other. So far we haven't kind of had a way of managing that, but it will become a challenge if we end up doing that part of the project where we are trying to come to consensus. That'll be more challenging, and we'll have to make sure to have like you know, different voices in the room to make sure that we have space to work out kind of whether there's a conclusion that everyone's happy with. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Next, we have presentation number 3. This will be on documenting data to improve trust and support use across disciplines and vocations. This will be presented virtually by Dr. Robert R. Downs. Dr. Robert R. Downs serves as the Senior Digital Archivist and Acting Head of Cyber Infrastructure and Informatics Research and Development at CIESIN, the Center for International Earth Science Information Network, a research and data center of the Columbia Climate School of Columbia University. His research interests include the development, management, use, evaluation, and scientific impact of data systems, digital libraries and repositories, digital preservation, data management, data policy, data confidentiality, software reuse, participatory design, business process redesign, and organizational change. If you can share your screen, please.
Yes. Can you see it? Yeah, can you see my screen? Can you see it now? So I'm going to talk about documenting data to improve trust and to support use across disciplines and vocations. And just a couple points I want to introduce to you first is the documentation. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but to have your data products and services documented really is enabling the users to decide on the applicability of the data and to determine how the data could be used. It provides opportunities to serve a diversified audience, and it just demonstrates the repository's commitment for enabling use. So, but there are also challenges associated with that. And for instance, producers who do not expect to be recognized or rewarded for such contributions may not be sufficiently motivated. And you know, that's an issue I think that we also need to address. So yes, data documentation is important initially for data discovery when people are looking for the data and just trying to determine what data sets are available. And if there's documentation about those data sets that they might be able to use to help them to utilize the data. And also whether, when they're deciding whether to consider using a particular data product, they want to know, is that data set appropriate for their planned study? Does this description of the data and the variables match their research objectives? And it's also helpful for research decision making. For instance, in terms of data use, we might be looking at what methodology would be appropriate to apply for the data, and hopefully that would be described in the documentation. You know, also if you're looking to reproduce the data, is that described in terms of the methodology for the data? And also whether the data are replicable. Also, when we think about data interpretation, we might ask, how can the data be interpreted in a manner that is consistent with the method in which the data were produced? And also, you know, if we're looking at particular methods that we're planning to employ or apply to the data, can we use those? Are those appropriate? And ideally, the data documentation would be describing this as well. then finally, looking at data integration, when we're thinking about combining the data with other data for the planned analysis, are they compatible? Can they be integrated to support the planned analysis, and can the data be included along with other data within a particular service? If you're planning to develop a service, for example, for multiple data sets, can this data set be included within that service? So the users really need to determine the fitness for use of any particular data set. And this is where the data documentation is really critical. You know, they need to verify their methodological assumptions, and ideally those would be described. And are those consistent with the proposed use of the data? And what about the quality of the data? Is that described as well? And is the data quality appropriate for this planned use? And also, what about the limitations of the data? Do they prohibit the kind of methods I'm planning to apply to the data, for example? So the data documentation have a lot of value in terms of data use. They can enable really diversified use of the data, and that could be diversification in terms of levels of expertise. That is not only supporting senior scientists who might be familiar with the data, but early career scientists and students, as well as the general public. And then we also need to be able to support the use of data across disciplines. So if people are working in other fields or thinking of integrating this data into a study in another field, or even to work across fields, will they be able to do that? And will the data documentation assist them in doing that? And data documentation also demonstrates a commitment for enabling use to the various stakeholders. For example, the data producers can see that their data deposit will facilitate data use if the data documentation are made available with their data. And peer reviewers, they have the ability to assess the data by reading the documentation, checking aspects of the data against the documentation, for example. And users can recognize the sources of the data in terms of the uses that they're planning to employ. And then funders can see the value of their investments. And then publishers can then justify recommending the data repository to other data producers, so that other producers might have a location where they could deposit their data. And then finally, in terms of demonstrating a commitment, it establishes the data center as a model among data repositories. Other data repositories can look at a data repository that's providing data documentation and say, you know, perhaps we should be doing this as well. But all data are not the same in terms of the value to users. And so since there's a wide range of review practice amongst data repositories, the data documentation can be a differentiating factor. And data documentation also helps to address the FAIR principles, the CARE principles, the trust principles, and the geodata management principles. So this is another reason for employing the use of data documentation and developing data documentation. But there are challenges associated with this, and that is we need to recognize data documentation as a research contribution. It's a contribution to open science if we're making the data documentation freely available. And it's going to improve the usability and the value of the data. And ideally, it should be released with the data and made freely available. There are similarities between the peer-reviewed data documentation and the published data paper. They both should be publicly accessible and associated with the data. and they both require a similar effort and provide value to research data users. But there are also differences between peer-reviewed data documentation and published data papers. For instance, there's a focus on the peer review of data in conjunction with the peer review of the documentation. There's also a credit for peer-reviewed documentation versus the credit for the peer-reviewed data paper, which might be published in a well-known journal. Then finally, looking at the hiring and promotion criteria, that should include open science research contributions, such as the publication of data, documentation, and software, and also the citation of those artifacts. So we really need to encourage data producers to share their data documentation. And we can do that by describing the benefits of documented data for enabling discovery and use, and linking from data to the data paper if it's available as open access, as an open access publication. We can also assist data producers in preparing their data documentation. For example, we can offer a data documentation template and even prepare an initial draft based on the data, the metadata, and communications with the data producers. We also can provide metrics for citations of data and documentation, and display references to articles that cited the data and the data documentation, and also display the counts of the publications. For instance, articles, books, and chapters, book chapters and proceedings that cited the data on the data documentation. So here I just wanted to briefly show you an example of a template for data documentation. This came from the NASA Socioeconomic Data and Applications Center, known as CDAC, which is operated by CIESIN, by work. And then in terms of motivating data documentation, we need to change the research culture. And we can do that by reviewing data documentation as part of the peer review of data. And we can conduct a rigorous review of the data and documentation, as some data repositories do. We can recognize data documentation as a scholarly contribution by rewarding the creation and sharing of data documentation, as well as the creation and sharing of data and software, and collect and reward metrics for data documentation. So we should consider shared data documentation as equivalent to a published data paper, and treat citations of data documentations like citations of a published paper. So we also need to overcome the negative perceptions of data documentation. Some data producers may consider data documentation to be just another task that's being added to their workload if they're not being recognized for that. So recognition for sharing data documentation and software is critical. And this is also in the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, where they say, consider the value and impact of all research outputs, including data sets and software. And so I'd like to have you just consider ways in which we might be able to balance research contributions and rewards for open science. Open data contributes to open science, and documentation enables the use of open data, and rewards encourage open science, and credit encourages data documentation. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions from the audience?
Thank you for an interesting presentation. I'm wondering, I agree with all what you presented, but I'm wondering, one part is not very well established yet. This peer review of data itself and documentation, the quality review. I'm wondering what the criteria will be there and how to establish a framework for peer review so that the rewards will be fair then to the researchers.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And when we're looking at data documentation, we really should make sure that it has, for instance, a recommended citation for the data, as well as a recommended citation for the data documentation. We need a really good description of the data that also explains potential uses. And if there are any limitations associated with the data, those should be well described within the data documentation. It's important also to give credit to all the different actors who've contributed to the creation of the data and the data documentation. And similar to when we look at a movie, for example, we see a credit screen in there saying, these people all contributed to a particular movie. We should have that in the data documentation as well. This is an opportunity to give credit not only to the producers of the data, but those who helped to curate the data, for example, those who helped do working on the data documentation, and those who helped to even facilitate the use of the data or the documentation in other ways. So also the quality aspects of the data should definitely be considered and included in the data documentation. And those all should be criteria used to assess the documentation of the data as well as the data themselves.
Well, thank you. I don't want to short our last presenter, so thanks again to Dr. Robert Downs. Now we'll move on to our last presentation, Modeling Cost of Computational Reproducibility and Data Verification in Political Science by Cheryl A. Thompson. Cheryl A. Thompson is a research data archivist at the Odom Institute for Research in Social Sciences at the University of North Carolina. Her research focuses on information infrastructure, specifically how to build and sustain data services, workflows, and tools capable of supporting scientific integrity and data preservation. As an archivist, she hopes to promote the trustworthiness of science through better data sharing, transparency of practice, and responsive education.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us to share this research. I do want to acknowledge my co-author, Thu-Mai Lewis. She's the Assistant Director of Archives at the Odom Institute, and she's also attending IASSIST virtually. So this presentation will briefly describe our project on modeling. I'll introduce the study design and give some preliminary results. And we had hoped to have more today for this talk, but life and COVID happened. So, but we'll be sharing some more of the models that we intend to run over the summer. So for those of you not familiar with the Odom Institute, just briefly, it's a social science research center at the University of North Carolina, located in the United States. Odom houses a data archive that provides trusted long-term stewardship of research data to promote reproducibility, broaden scientific inquiry, and foster data literacy. So a distinction of today's research landscape is the increasing demand for reproducible research. I know there's a lot of terms being thrown out when people talk about reproducibility, and there's varying definitions depending on the communities that you're in. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. When I say computational reproducibility, I am referring to Victoria Stodden's definition, which is taking the same data and code that an author used and then being able to get the same results using those products. But I would say in my experience, we need to extend that definition from just data and code and to include more documentation, like Dr. Downs was talking about. Documentation and other research materials that might be required to help interpret the data or the files, or to understand the computational approaches that were taken. So in many fields, there's debate going on about computational reproducibility. Is there a crisis? What's the feasibility of having a policy and a standard? The political science community has a long history with data sharing and more recently computational reproducibility policies. So in 2015, the American Journal of Political Science, AJPS, adopted a verification policy where authors whose manuscripts had been accepted for publication must provide the materials required to verify their results. And actually publication in AJPS is contingent upon passing this verification audit. And so AJPS has contracted with third parties to perform an independent check. And for the quantitative analyses, the verification process is carried out at the Odom Institute. But for the qualitative analyses, the verification is handled by the Qualitative Data Repository at Syracuse University. And so this talk today will really focus on the quantitative verification that we do at Odom. And so to give our presentation just a little bit of context, because some of you might not be as familiar with what a verification audit and workflow might look like. We think of it as comprised of two sides, the curation workflow and then the verification workflow. So for the curation side, we are checking the materials to make sure it's complete, it's well documented so that you can understand what these files are and how they relate. Also, you can interpret and use the data. And we're also checking that the files are in formats that are preservation friendly, or at least community recommendations. And then for the verification workflow, this includes inspecting the code to ensure that it's complete, everything's there, it's well documented, it compiles and it executes. And then we compare the outputs to the results that are in the manuscript. So and that's in-text results, it's tables, it's figures to make sure that we get the same results. And so after we complete the curation and the verification checks, the authors receive a verification report. And this is a sample one on the slide. And so if authors do not pass both the curation and the verification checks, then they can resubmit their materials and we'll sort of go through the curation and the verification check again. And so it's sort of a rinse and repeat until they pass both sides, the curation and the verification. So how are we doing? So we've performed this check for over 400 AJPS manuscripts. And right now, the average number of resubmissions is 2, and only a handful of manuscripts pass on the first submission. The average hours for our staff is about 6. And I would say these trends have been holding steady for the last few years. And so what this tells me is that reproducible science, it might seem easy, just give me your data, give me your code, but in practice, it can actually be pretty challenging for authors, especially trying to figure out what it is we need for verification and anticipating the effects of moving their files from their computer to our environment. So our research is sort of situated here where we're trying to understand, well, what are the challenges for computational reproducibility and what are some of the costs of having these verification policies? We started out with some just simple research questions. You know, what are the challenges that authors face in complying with the verification policy? What are the errors that we see? And then we also wanted to know if we could predict which manuscripts might take longer to verify or might require more resubmissions. So we designed a mixed method study to investigate this. And so first we began with a close examination, a qualitative coding and analysis of our verification reports to really understand the errors and the challenges that we see. And last year at IASSIST, we actually presented on some of the preliminary coding. And last year we presented on the reports from 2017 to 2019, but we've extended this analysis and we've included all verified AJPS manuscripts from 2017 up to 2021. And so that's a sample of 290 manuscripts that we're looking at. And so we are conducting iterative coding of the verification reports for these manuscripts to understand the types and the prevalence of the errors. And then we're still in, we had hoped to be done with this by the time we did this presentation, but we're actually just winding it up right now. And once we complete this coding, then we will move on to conducting the statistical models and trying to understand if we can predict which errors and which factors might lead to longer verification times. So for this research, we had three primary data sources. The first one is the Odum AJPS verification tracking database. And this is a pretty unique resource because this contains all of our verification reports, our notes, dates when things were submitted, what were the results, how many resubmissions, who were the assigned verifiers and curators. And so it's been a really rich resource to do the coding and to look at the types of errors that we're seeing. We also have constructed information on the author's replication packages. So we were curious to look at the number of files and especially to get some more information on the types of coding they were doing. So how many code files were there? What were the programming languages? Sometimes authors use one, sometimes there's more than one in there. Looking at how many lines of codes, how many comments were in those files. And then finally, we also collected information on the authors. So we were interested in capturing how many authors were on the manuscripts and also the corresponding author. Did they have any previous experience with AJPS? Sort of where are they in their career, as well as the types of employers that they're working for. So as I said, we did present on some of the coding and the qualitative analysis last year, but these results today include an additional set of 185 manuscripts that we've coded. And so we did iterative coding of the curation and the verification issues and challenges that were brought up. And these are ones that were identified by Odom staff. And we have identified 23 distinct types of errors. And so from last time, some of these error types were in the last year's presentation, but the definitions have sort of been refined. We've also added a few more to our list that we're looking at. And these 23 types are associated with the 7 categories that you see on the left side of the slide. And I think when I look at these categories, I think they really draw my attention to that they're sort of across multiple dimensions of the research process. And I think they illuminate some of the areas where reproducible research can be challenging for our authors. So the next phase of our research was to do some modeling to try to understand the cost of the verification and what factors might lead to longer verifications. And so I'm sort of going to talk about the models that we're intending to run this summer. So the type of this type of modeling, when we were reviewing the literature, it's really not been done. People have not really done much modeling on a verification and sort of what are the factors that affect reproducibility in this way. And so this type of work will really address a gap in the literature. So for the main analyses, we will be running time to event models. And time to event modeling is unique because the outcome is not just whether or not an event occurred, like they passed verification or we completed a verification report for them. But you can also include, well, how long did it take to get to that event? So how many days did it take from the submission of the materials to having that final verification result? And so traditional regression models are not really well suited for this to include both of these outcomes, of whether or not this event happened, as well as how long did it take for the event to happen. And so we're very excited, and we think the time to event models will be a really good choice for what we're hoping to do with our research. So the first time to event model that we're planning to run, so an important thing about time to event models is defining, well, what is your target event? What is the event that, this is sort of where we're interested in. And so we wanted to make sure it was an event that everybody in the sample would have had happen. And so we chose to look at how long it took to complete the verification report for the initial submission. So our event is that initial verification report. And we, as I said, we chose this because everybody in the sample would have it. And so based on the previous literature, our hypothesis here would be that the code quality, the transparency of the computational environment, the modeling quality, the size of the replication package, as well as the complexity of the programming and the verifier's workload would impact how long it takes to get that initial verification report. But on the flip side, so for the curation workflows, we look at slightly different issues. And so we wanted to flip it and run another time to event model, just looking at the curator and the curation report. And so our target event for this model is set as the completed curation report for the initial submission. And as I said before, we chose it because everybody will at least have an initial report. And so based on the previous literature, our hypothesis is that the documentation quality, the size of the replication package, the data errors, as well as the author's prior experience with the verification audit and our curator's workload will likely impact how long it takes to produce that initial curation report. And so the final model that we're expecting to run will be a regression analysis, and we're hoping to look at the factors that are impacting the number of times that a manuscript has to be resubmitted in this verification process. And so with this, we hypothesize that the author's prior experience, the code quality, the programming complexity, as well as the computational environment, the documentation quality, and the use of non-deterministic models will predict the number of resubmissions. So with this research, we think we'll be able to identify factors that affect the time to verify, and it'll help inform strategies to reduce the overall costs of implementing verification audits and policies like this. And hopefully it'll further establish the AJPS policy as a feasible model that other journals could adopt. And this study will also contribute to the discussion on reproducibility. I think we'll be able to identify some specific areas where research practice could be changed, or we could have better support for helping our authors produce more reproducible research packages. And then it will also, this research will provide a novel approach to modeling the verification process. So using some new data, as well as implementing some methods that have not been applied to this topic yet. So just to finish up quickly, I'm going to talk about the next steps. So as I said, we should finish up the qualitative coding just right after this conference. And then we'll move into actually running some of these statistical models. And then we hope that after we do this, we'll be able to produce a set of targeted guidance for authors, but also We can think about how we can help archives and research organizations extend their services to computational reproducibility, and where they can help support researchers better in this process. We also think that it can inform some training in the area of computational reproducibility and verification. So like maybe focusing on better coding practices or documentation, as well as understanding, how to capture the compute environment and what dependencies might be important in citing data better. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions. And please catch me around IASSIST, or you can also contact me at work as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? I did see one online.
Yeah, there's quite the discussion happening online, so I can bring it up in case anyone's not. What we might have to do is load this into Whova so that the conversation can continue. But there was the original question about how can journals enact policies for quality documentation without placing additional burden on their peer reviewers. So I don't know if anyone that presented wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from Cheryl because I already answered in the chat. And yeah, I'm really intrigued.
Yes, and I already answered in the chat as well. So let's hear from Cheryl.
Well, actually doing this curation check that we do as part of the verification audit, I think authors are really surprised, some of the comments that we get. And, one of the things I always like to say is, we're sort of on your side, like we're the first set of eyes looking at this, and if I can't make sense of some of this, like what's in your package, or, I don't understand how your data file is constructed, that I could actually reuse it. I think that, implementing this as part of the verification or as even part of data sharing, some journals have data sharing policies, and being able to have that curation check and just to get that feedback, I think is really valuable. And that's why, one of the reasons in the model we put the prior experience with AJPS's verification audit. And my hunch is that authors who have been through it before sort of have an understanding of, well, what types of documentation do I need, and what is, what should go in the code book, what types of computational environment information do I need to share. So, I guess I would say, I think, the JEDI group is a really nice sort of community. We're sort of bringing together journal editors and data archivists, and maybe trying to continue that conversation of how, data archivists can do a curation review and be involved in the peer review process.
Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, then we'll close it up for today. Thank you very much to our panelists and our audience.
Thank you.